All right, we have another Caro Kann in the climb to 2200. And all right, d5, and my opponent will have to choose from many different options, whether it be pawn e5, whether it be the exchange with taking, whether it be knight c3, knight d2, even bishop d3 is playable. My opponent chooses the exchange variation, and he may go for c4, the Panov, which is what I personally play with the white pieces. And that is exactly what he goes for. And I think that every Caro Kann player needs to know what to do against the Panov, because I think, for me, objectively, okay, maybe that's subjectively, but I think it's the hardest line to face, like 100%, because it takes you completely out of any normality of the Caro. Like, your d5 pawn in basically every other line is strong and sturdy, and you play around it. In the Panov, white just throws literally everything he possibly can at this d5 pawn. Even queen b3 is played in many lines. So trying to play against this requires you to play in an unnatural manner in comparison to other Caro Kann lines. So my opponent is actually playing the exact line that I play with the white pieces. So the main line is knight to f3 here, and both sides just get all of their knights out. However, black has the option of bishop to g4. I don't play it personally, but black has the option to go bishop g4, which can lead to some basically a forced endgame, which I'll show you after in the analysis. I don't recommend it for white or black. I think it's kind of boring, to be honest. Yeah, I don't really see a need. It takes any fun out of the position. What bishop g5 is doing is pretty simple. White is threatening to take the knight on f6 and then win the pawn on d5. So we have two ways of addressing this, essentially. One, we can go pawn e6, defending the pawn. But that does block in our light squared bishop. However, maybe we can go bishop b4 to take some pressure off the center. But two, the move that I prefer is bishop e6, which looks odd because it's like, well, okay, well now you can't move your e-pawn, so how are you going to develop your dark squared bishop? Well, what I prefer to do in these lines, and this is down to preference, but I think it's a very interesting way to go about it for black, is to instead try to develop the bishop to g7. And the idea is that because white has pushed his e and c pawns, right, this d4 pawn can't be protected by another pawn. And as long as we maintain good control of the d5 square, the d4 pawn shouldn't be able to advance to d5. Now, why is that important? Well, it means that the d4 pawn is stranded on d4 and can't be protected by another pawn. So what we would like to do is play moves like bishop g7, and go after the pawn on d4. Maybe in future we open up the d-file and add a queen into the mix. Maybe we bring a rook to d8 and the queen to b6. We're obviously going to castle kingside. And in the long run, maybe we can generate counterplay against the d4 pawn, and even the b2 pawn can become quite weak in many lines. So it's how I personally like to play this position. It looks very unnatural. Again, like, you know, in a Caro Kann, normally you're looking to play a move like bishop f5 and pawn e6. And that would be great. If you can get that in this position, it's actually really good for black. But bishop f5 is a blunder. Obviously, you're going to be losing your d5 pawn. White can just play take and take. But also, it weakens b7 a lot. And moves like queen b3 can be very annoying. So my opponent goes rook c1. I don't think I've ever seen this move before. I'm not going to lie. That's a new one, but I don't think it changes what we're doing particularly. I think we can still go for our pawn g6, bishop g7 idea. And here, this is a crucial moment for white, because white puts the bishop on g5, right? Obviously, when he could have maybe developed some of his other pieces, or could have put the bishop on a square like f4 to look at this nice diagonal. Yeah, but see, the thing is, a lot of the time it's good to take on f6 before I get the chance to go bishop to g7, because then you ensure that I double my pawns and isolate my d-pawn, right? c5 is probably a fine move, but after bishop g7, now my knight is fine. If you take, I'll take with the bishop and keep my pawns intact. because you've also taken pressure off of my d5 pawn, I can now move my light squared bishop to a square like g4 because it doesn't need to defend the d5 pawn anymore. So, for example, a move like bishop to g4 maybe threatens something like knight to e4, and d4 is incredibly weak. Incredibly weak. So we'll start with castling. I'd like to go knight e4, but I think we should castle first. Also takes the sting out of moves like bishop to b5 because our knight won't be pinned. And to be honest, I think this is a pretty ideal setup for us. This c5 pawn can be annoying, and we need to watch out for it. Because effectively what white has done has created a 3 versus 2 on the queen side by advancing the pawn to c5. So we do need to be careful that white doesn't generate too much counterplay. But okay, bishop to e2 makes sense. Knight e4 looks nice. It can't be taken because the knight would have to move and d4 would hang. So I don't really see a reason not to play this. We're also hitting the bishop, so we're threatening something like take, take, and take. And if knight takes e6, we can take with our knight, although that would hang the d5 pawn, so maybe we just take with the f pawn and be up a pawn, which I'm not going to complain about. And also, if the d4 pawn falls, then c5 could be quite weak in the future. By the way, if you're enjoying the video so far, please drop a like and subscribe if you haven't already. I'd really appreciate it. And I think this is basically the sort of setup that we want. Again, now that white has committed to c5, taking pressure off of d5, we can move our bishop to somewhere like f5 or g4. The bishop doesn't have to sit on e6, because it is awkward. I'm well aware that it's awkward, but it's also necessary in some of these lines to be able to fianchetto the dark squared bishop, which is going to be our better bishop, really, because the white d4 pawn is very weak, as we can see. So, of course, our dark squared bishop is going to be the more important one, at least for the time being. Okay, bishop e3. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Of course, you don't want me to take you, and you want to make sure that the d4 pawn is defended. And, okay, bishop g4 looks interesting, but we don't actually have a threat of winning the d4 pawn because it's well defended for the time being. We could take the knight on c3. I'm not sure if that really does anything, though. I feel like we want white to take us because it opens up our queen, opens up our bishop. This bishop is putting pressure on, hits the knight, so I don't really see a reason to do that. b6 is interesting. I'm not sure I love it. It weakens the knight. And also, are we gonna... Oh, no, we would take, because then we have moves like d4, I think. Yeah, we do protect that enough times. Okay, well, okay. If b6 and white castles, take... if d4 our knight hangs, if taken rook takes, then d4 wins. So white would have to play b takes, which completely ruins his structure. And a move like queen a5 hits all of the weak pawns, so that's quite nice. So after b6, white can't castle. If white takes, our knight is very weak. We could go queen b6. Hitting b2, putting pressure on d4. And then maybe bishop g4 is a threat. We go for like rook c8. I think b6 makes a lot of sense. If b6, queen a4, hitting the knight. It's a more difficult question to answer. Maybe we should start with rook c8 and then go b6. Because if we go like b6... queen a4, rook c8, maybe just bishop a6, which could be annoying. I mean, we could go rook c7, I suppose. Then have to take, our queen is disconnected, so we'd have to take with the pawn. Do I really want to do that? I don't know. There's this interesting idea of pawn f5, trying to play pawn f4, and kick the bishop back and win the d4 pawn. That's actually quite interesting. It's very interesting. Pawn f5, yeah. If g3, just stopping the advancement, I mean, it's not a very nice move to have to play for white. That much is obvious. I'm not sure we have a continuation, though. Maybe we can go f4 anyway. If bishop... No. Bishop takes bishop h3. It's interesting, but perhaps bishop g4 is the way to go. But I don't know. Bishop g4 castles. Perhaps we should be playing for e5. That sort of thing. We could go queen a5 so that b6 is prepared because we stop bishop b5 and queen a4 ideas because we could take the knight and then the pieces would hang and our queen is defended. That's interesting. I think I like that. Let's go queen a5. Also frees up the d8 square for the rook. We probably want to put the a rook on c8 and the f rook on d8. I think that's the natural squares for the rooks. We could go for e5 in the future, but for the time being, our bishop has to stay on e6 to defend the d5 pawn, although the knight is pinned, so technically he's not threatening anything. We maybe have a threat of taking on c3 and then taking on a2, because of course the knight is defending the a2 pawn, which might be viable. We've got to be careful our queen doesn't get trapped, but I think we could always evacuate via the a5 square if the rook takes on c3. So, for example, let's say white castles here, and we play knight takes c3, rook takes c3, queen a2. Yeah, he does go a3, which is kind of what I was expecting, which I feel like is slightly more difficult to deal with. I think it's a good move. b4 can't be played because a3 hangs, which is very much worth noting. So I think b6 makes a lot of sense. If b4 we take, knight is hanging. Again, if you take here, you're going to cause all kinds of problems for yourself. I think b6. I mean, that was the point of queen a5, right? To prepare pawn b6. Also, we're stopping bishop a6 ideas. This is very interesting because white still isn't castled. So, I mean, his knight can't move. If b4, I don't think taking makes sense because after rook takes, a3 is defended. So I feel like we're just helping white out if we do something like that. But the fact that we have the pressure means that the rook can't really move. And if white tries to take us, obviously he can't take us right now because his knight is pinned. But let's say something like b4, queen a3, knight e4, d4, then their knight is hanging. We open up our bishop. We open up the d file to go after the d4 pawn. So something like rook d8. And I think we're doing very, very well in that position. So I'm very happy with how this has gone. Obviously, we'll dive into some of the other lines in the analysis. I'm going to just close my blinds quickly because this lighting is really weird. Okay, I think that's better. We're also pretty equal on time, which is good. Considering, like I said, I think we've gotten the better out of the opening after the first 12 moves. And yeah, hopefully you can also see how different this is to a normal Caro Kann. Whether you play the Caro Kann yourself, or maybe you watch me play the Caro Kann on many of my other videos, you should notice, like, this is incredibly different to what is normally played. Okay, my opponent takes, which is probably the best move. I think it probably is. So now we have a choice. So we have to take the b6 pawn. I think that much is clear. I don't think we have any other threats. If we take, rook takes, our knight is under attack. So why would we do that? We're certainly not going to be taking on d4 yet. So yeah, we should be taking the b6 pawn. How should we take? I don't think a takes makes a lot of sense. It does mean that our queen maintains the pin, but I feel like it makes more sense to take with the queen, so we apply pressure to b2, d4, and defend the knight. And also, we give the rook the b file. I don't think the a file is that useful because the a3 pawn is well protected. So let's do this. Queen b6. Oh, whoa. Oh, okay, no, that's interesting. So if queen b2, knight e4, de4, knight is hanging. If he takes my knight, I take his knight, bishop takes. It's interesting. Interesting. What if we take... playable, but I'm not sure I love it. I'm also leaning towards rook fc8 or rook ac8. Maybe rook ac8. And just defending my knight preemptively. If take in a move like d5, we can just go rook d8. This is open. I think that's quite nice. Oh no, that would hit my queen. Ooh, that is worth noting. That would hit my queen. Okay, that changes things. That changes things. So maybe we should take. Maybe we should take. If rook takes, again, if we take on b2, then he takes on c6. So rook fc8. I think that's the way to go. I think that's the way to go. Just because, yeah, my opponent taking, us taking with the d-pawn does open up our bishop, but d5 is going to be a massive problem. I don't want to allow that. So I think my opponent's navigated this pretty well, to be fair. Let's go rook fc8. My opponent can go rook b3, but I don't think it does very much. The rook is just strangely placed on the b3 square. Our light squared bishop can always get into the game via g4 or f5, so I'm not really concerned about that. And then we can maybe go e6 to secure the d5 pawn. And I think it's an interesting imbalance in this position because white has the 2-on-1 on the queen side. He has the queen side majority. If he can trade off a set of pawns, he will have a passed pawn on the queen side. Whether it will be a strength or a weakness, though, is yet to be determined. But alternatively, well, not alternatively. However, the d4 pawn is very weak, right? And it's isolated. We do not have an open d-file against it, though, which, you know, is worth noting. But okay, pawn b4. All right, white starts to push his pawns. The rook is hanging, but we don't really have any useful discoveries because a move like knight to b4. The point is that white can take on c8 with check, and after we take back, we lose the knight, and we gain nothing. So, yeah. Self-explanatory. Bishop g4 looks very good. I don't really see a reason not to play it. And I literally just want to take and play e6. I'll give white the bishop pair. And then I will put all of my pawns on light squares. You know, I'll create a light squared pawn chain, which is Caro Kann-esque. And basically say to white, okay, you may have the bishop pair, but how on earth are you defending d4? Because my knight and my bishop can target d4. Only one of your bishops can defend it. Because it's a dark square. White knights can use both color complexes. Whereas bishops can only use one, obviously. So perhaps it's a good idea for white to, I don't know, try a move like knight e5 to keep the knight on the board. Knight e5, if knight e5... Well, no, it's rook's hanging. If knight e5, rook c8 check, rook c8, d e5, my queen is under attack, bishop e2, queen e2, pawn d4, bishop f4, defending the e6, sorry, the e5 pawn. That's interesting. That's interesting. I have a passed d pawn, but again, is it a strength or a weakness? Tough to say. Of course, I don't think we're forced to do that, but it's just a line worth noting. We could have also gone bishop f5, but I think bishop g4 makes more sense because I don't want my bishop to be a target on f5 for, I don't know, moves like knight to h4. And also, the bishop on f5 isn't doing anything, really. I mean, does white actually want to put a rook on b1 or a queen on c2? I don't think so. I think the queen probably wants to go to d2, if anything. So, at least on g4, we can see a lot of white pieces. And again, I'm not fussed about trading off my light squared bishop because we can always replace it with light squared pawns to block off my opponent's light squared bishop. So, yeah, I think this is going pretty well, to be fair. And, like I said, the chess is like a debate, essentially, right? So the debate currently in this position is, okay, white can create a passed pawn. Is the potential for a passed pawn for white equivalent or a greater advantage than the disadvantage of having the isolated d-pawn and the fact that these this queenside majority might become 1, weak, or 2, immobile? So, for example, here, I would say they're not weak necessarily, but they're pretty immobile, in my opinion. And also, again, the d4 pawn is quite weak. So it's a debate, essentially. And I don't know the answer to it currently, but we will hopefully find out. Also, I'm just starting to think, if I move like knight e5, I don't have to take with a knight, do I? I don't have to take with the knight. I could take with the bishop and then play for d4 to fork the white pieces and keep the c-file closed to disallow an exchange of rooks. Rook c5. Okay, that's quite an interesting move. So disconnecting my queen from the d4 square, which makes a lot of sense. I think that's quite a strong move. I don't think there's a rush to take on f3, to be honest. I don't know. Maybe? Take pawn e6. The light square bishop kind of sucks. Alternatively, if we go for the immediate e6, and we haven't. No, I think we should take. While we have the opportunity, because I do think d4. Although white has dealt with the threat for now, the threat, like the weakness of the d4 pawn, still remains. It still remains. And I think this is very difficult for white to play because his light squared bishop doesn't really do anything. Because all of his important pawns are on dark squares, so it can't help with that. His dark squared bishop is literally just acting as a big pawn. It's not really doing bishop-esque things, right? It's just a massive pawn. Yeah, moves like e5 are interesting because if take, I can go for moves like d4 maybe, but of course that would hang the d5 pawn for the time being. So, although I could have played a move like rook to d8 to defend the pawn and then play for e5, I'd much rather my pawn be carrying out defensive duties than my rook, because the pawn isn't very valuable, whereas my rook is quite valuable. So if my pawns can keep this bishop at bay, that's effectively 2 points of material, my E and D pawns, keeping 3 points of material, the light square bishop, at bay, which is better than my rook and a pawn doing it, which would be 6, keeping 3 points at bay, if that makes sense. So we also have the possibility of bishop to f8. That was also one of the other considerations of playing pawn e6, because this rook is very annoying. Very annoying. It's disconnecting my queen, providing potential for white applying a lot of pressure to the c-file, which I obviously don't want. And also, it's very difficult for us to take here with a rook, because then white gets a passed pawn, right? Whether he takes with the b or the d pawn. Probably the d pawn, though. So I don't really want the rook there, and my knight will take a bit of time to be able to boot the rook away. I don't know, would have to reach d7 somehow. But if it goes to b8, obviously I hang my c-rook. So that's not very easy. So I think bishop f8 will be a very useful move to kick the rook away. I don't think sacrificing the exchange will be good enough for white in that scenario, as in allowing me to take and taking with the pawn and trying to compensate the exchange down for saying, okay, well, I have the bishop pair and I have a passed pawn. I don't think that's enough. So, okay, queen c2. I think bishop f8 makes a lot of sense. Kicking the rook back to c3. Again, white could play a move like rook c1 and sacrifice the bishop and say, okay, I've got the bishop pair and I've got a passed pawn after he takes back, and I can, you know, make something happen with that. Maybe, but I'm not so sure. Personally, I'm not so sure. So, okay, I think this is quite nice. Yeah, the rook goes back to c3. Awesome. Oof. It's interesting, but it doesn't work because my queen is under fire. Yeah, something like knight d4, rook c8, knight c2, just bishop b6. So that doesn't work, unfortunately. Interesting, though. What if I double up? I think I have to play a move like knight e7, to be honest. Firstly, trying to get the knight to f5 to put pressure on. But also, I can't allow white to play this scot-free. I need to challenge him ASAP. Because the c file is obviously the only open file on the board. It's very important. And I need to not give white a monopoly over the c file. If I allow a move like rook fc1, it's going to become very difficult to challenge it. But this looks fine. Can exchange and go rook c8. This sacrifice doesn't work because queen takes, knight takes, rook takes. I have the important king g7, unpinning my bishop and not allowing, oh my god, and not allowing bishop to h6, which would lose me the game, of course. So I have the extra tempo. Okay, queen retreats. All right, I like this, I think. I like this. Rook c6 looks interesting. I could take, and maybe even go for queen c6, offering a queen trade, and then basically saying to white, okay, your d4 pawn is going to fall. It's viable. Knight f5 hangs my rook, so I can't do that. I could go bishop to g7, although then rook c5. Yeah, rook c5 is annoying. I can't allow that. Yeah, let's take. Rook c5 is an issue, I think. Okay, queen c1. I think I should just offer a trade. Maybe I should start with bishop g7. The queen... Yeah, but then queen c5. Queen c5 is the problem. That's the problem. If I go queen c6, queen c5. If I move the knight, my queen hangs. Knight f5. Queen c5. No, sorry, my bishop defends c5. Yeah, maybe knight f5 then. Am I really threatening to take on d4? I would say yes. I think so. Maybe. It's difficult to say. Difficult to say. Yeah, queen c6, I get hit with queen c5. That's no good. Knight f5. What does white play there? Let's say bishop g4. If bishop g7, I get hit with queen c8 check. That's very uncomfortable. I probably lose after bishop h6 gets played. So maybe I take. I mean, I don't want to play an opposite color bishop position, but maybe I have to. Is something like queen takes, I can take the c file. There's still play in the position. d4 is still weak. I think I should go for that. Opposite color bishops are obviously mostly drawish, but not always. Not always. And with queen still on the board, opposite color bishops tend to favor the attacking side, of course. So if we can start to try to attack white with the opposite color bishops, that could be fruitful. But I think more so it's the fact that d4 pawn is stuck on a dark square. That's why I think we could generate play. And if he takes with the pawn, I don't know. Okay, queen c3. That's fine. We don't have to panic. A5. Take, check here. No. I could go h5 to give my king some luft. So if bishop g7, queen c8, king h7. Because if I go for this straight away, then just this. So I think that makes sense. I'm not sure queen c3 does anything. The queen the queen controls all the same squares, other than d4, of course. Yeah, maybe king h7 is the move to prepare bishop g7. Although bishop g7, if queen c5... Ooh, that's a big commitment. Take, take, take. Yeah, it's got to be that. Got to be that. Bishop g7. Now, I suppose this pawn isn't as weak anymore because it's defended by the e-pawn. I'm trying to set up some potential traps of... Okay, my opponent offered a draw. I'm not going to accept it. Not for now, anyway. Just because I think white has a few weaknesses that we can try and go after. And we have potential sacrifices to pick up the bishop in certain lines as well. We also have 2 pawn islands. White has 3 pawn islands. My opponent's offered me another draw. I just think that we have the better end of this. Our king's safer. Our pawns are more together. White has a more active queen, I would admit. Obviously, his queen controls the c-file, and I don't. We also don't have e2 as an infiltration square via the a6 to f1 diagonal, which would have been nice. Okay, queen c5. Well, I'm not going to take that, of course, because I don't want to give him a passed pawn, but queen a6 looks interesting. Looking at this, looking at this. Also stopping queen c8. I mean, it's not that big a deal anyway. Queen c7. Yeah, the thing is, white has quite a few weaknesses. The bishop is also quite compromised for the time being. And we just don't. I mean, we have f7 and a7. Our queen is controlling a7 nicely. Or defending a7 nicely. And f7 is difficult for white to really go after because our king is currently defending it. And to get my king off of g8, you have to give a back rank check. b5 is a nice move. Didn't see that. Which opens up the queen's defense, but I guess we can go queen to a5. If check just this, that's fine. We could go queen b6, but if we take, if white takes, then okay, yeah, our a pawn controls both of these pawns, but white isn't going to take. So let's go queen a5, threatening some kind of infiltration. That is more interesting. I'm also tempted to go queen d8 to come in this way. I know we can play take and bishop f8 and win this pawn, but being up 1 pawn in an opposite color bishop endgame isn't going to be enough. It's not going to be enough. If queen c7, then queen c5. That's no good. So I think queen d8. If queen d8, queen c5 going after a7, queen g5 hitting the bishop and the pawn. If taken, take with check. King here, check, king here. We do have to be careful. Very careful. But I think we can manufacture some kind of checkmate. And the bishop coming to h6, we can always put the king on g7 to hide. Yeah, I think that's good. Let's come back. I want to try to win this. I suppose a move like pawn h3 might hold things together, but then maybe we even have f5 to be really aggressive. I don't know. Queen c5, queen g5, pawn h3, pawn f5, queen c8 check, king h7, queen e6, fg4, hg4. But also e3 hangs, so that's not even going to solve the issue. Because I can just take on e3. Something like, I don't know, queen c5, queen g5, pawn h3, take with check, and then d4 is going to hang, and a7 is going to be... Oh yeah, that's completely winning. And this is what I mean. Like, because the queens are still on the board, even though we have opposite colored bishops, there is still play. There is still play. Okay, the queen retreats. Very passive move. Maybe necessary, but it is passive. Queen here, queen here. Not thrilled. I feel like bishop f8 is interesting. Hitting the a3 pawn. Pawn a4. Oh, sorry, the queen defends that square. We can't do that. We could go bishop d6, though. Bishop f8, pawn a4, bishop d6, stopping queen g3. Which makes queen g5 more of a threat. It's interesting. Let's do it. Give our king the g7 square as well. So back rank. So not back rank, but like checks on the back rank aren't too big a deal. Yeah, if we go here, 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 take here, the queen just comes back and we get nothing. I mean, we can give a check and pick up the a5 pawn maybe. a4 pawn even. But, I don't know. We can give a check on b8. I'm not convinced. I feel like keeping the bishops on the board is easier to try to win. And I mean, this bishop is fantastic. It's a great bishop. c5 is a very important square, because obviously that's where he was putting his queen previously. So now queen g5 is a threat, because... I mean, how do you defend that? Because f5 is on the way. That's the issue. The point of queen g3 is that it also breaks the pin on the bishop. Okay. Could go f5. Maybe it's too much, though. It does weaken our position. Queen g5. The king has to move. Let's say king h1. Because otherwise f5 will win the bishop. Because it would be pinned. I can still go f5, though. Bishop f3. h3 is weak. I don't have a good way of hitting it, though. F4 is interesting, although it does hang e6 and d5. Again, I do think we have the upper hand here. We could try to double up on the diagonal. Although maybe queen f2 just defends everything. That just makes d4 very weak. That's not going to be any good. I feel like this is an interesting way to go about it. Because the problem is, like I said, way earlier on when I traded my bishop on f3 for the knight, is that by having my pawns on light squares, his light squared bishop is going to really struggle to get in the game. And as we can see, it's really struggling. Okay, king f1. Alright. Let's go queen d6 as planned. We're not threatening any kind of checkmate, but we're threatening to make things very uncomfortable. Like, you know, maybe queen h2 followed by f5, kicking the bishop away and then winning the h3 pawn. That could be very scary. With queens on the board, this is not a simple draw for white. If the queens come off the board, yeah, dead draw, for sure. But the queens are on the board. And that is the big problem. But unlike white, we have a very safe king. Okay. That's not too concerning. Of course, we're maintaining defense. The problem is that even if white gets some kind of check on the back rank, after king g7, you have no way of continuing the checks. Because we control the e5 square. That would be the only way to continue. But white doesn't have that. We're, of course, threatening queen h1, picking up the queen. We're also threatening stuff like bishop g3 to try and checkmate white. This is very uncomfortable. And what I'm saying with the back rank is, let's say bishop g3 is played and white goes queen c8 check and we go king g7. There's no more checks. The checks are gone. You can try sacrifice on e6 maybe, but I don't have to accept the sacrifice. And at the end of the day, these 3 pawns are still super, super weak. Super weak. Unlike my pawns, they're nicely together. Yeah, queen c6, okay. I don't think checking makes sense. I think we're completely winning, to be honest. Queen e8, king g7. Again, bishop e6. If we take, okay, then maybe white can continue the checks, but we just checkmate. There is just checkmate. And I don't see a way for white to defend. This is pretty dire. And like I said, opposite colored bishops favor the attacking side, because white's light squared bishop can't defend the dark squares, and we're exploiting the dark squares with 2 pieces, our queen and our bishop. White can only use his queen, and yeah, it's not enough. And this is what I was saying. The position, although if the queens come off the board back here after the trades, if the queens come off the board, it's a draw. But I mean, if we check the engine right here, the engine gives minus 1.5, minus 1.6 even, simply because the queens are on the board and the white king is weak and the white pawns are weak and the white bishop can't do anything. So very, very useful endgame lesson, I feel like. Hopefully you guys enjoyed. Let's jump into the analysis and see what the computer has to say. Okay, my opponent had 82.9% accuracy. We had 92.5, which is pretty damn good considering how complicated that game was. But I think the opening went very well. So, as I mentioned before, the Panov is what I play. And this is the Panov position. I play this with the white pieces. And I played the exact line that my opponent played with bishop to g5. It's a very difficult opening for to face with the black pieces. Very, very difficult. And I do like what my opponent did by not going knight f3. Because after knight f3, I play pawn g6 as the black pieces to go for a similar setup. But objectively, bishop g4 is the best move. And you can get some forced draw lines. I think it's cd5, knight d5, queen b3, bishop f3, gf3. Is it gf3? Yeah, gf3, pawn e6, queen b7, knight d4, bishop b5. It's very complicated. Check, check, take. And this is a very strange position, obviously. But white can also go for this and get into this forced endgame. And, I mean, I don't really see the point. It just seems very boring to me. So, that's one of the reasons I play bishop g5 with the white pieces, as does my opponent. And like I said, you can go e6. You can go bishop e6. I think you can even take on c4. But I think bishop e6 is the more interesting option. The rook c1, which the engine likes, but after pawn g6, black is dead equal essentially. And yeah, this is a difficult decision for white whether to take on f6 or not. It's actually not that good an option here. C5 is a decent move. Bishop g7, knight f3, we castle, bishop e2, and you can see that we already have a slight advantage because we've just navigated the position well, and we're on track to go after the d4 pawn. Knight e4 is the best move here. This can't be taken because de4, the knight is hit. The knight moves, and then we win this, and then everything opens up, and we completely crush the white position. So bishop e3 played, which is a good move. Oh, I always forget about this. I always forget about the sack on c5. I always forget. Yeah, and this is just very nice. Bishop takes, let's say bishop takes. Queen takes, knight takes, and material is equal. But I think white has a lot of weaknesses. So the engine recommends b3, rook fd8, castle, let's say. And here, apparently, we are close to winning. Because white just can't defend everything. And if b4 is played to defend the c5 pawn, we can play take. Because if take, we can take with check and win the game. So I went queen a5, which is a mistake because knight c5 is better. The position is still equal, though. Here, my opponent goes a3. We go b6, not the best move. Rook a8 is better. Rook a8? No way. Why not rook fd8? Just not good. I don't know. We go b6. White takes, which is good. Queen takes is inaccurate. Taking with the pawn is better. Okay. And after castles, rook ac8. Take, then we're fine because now this doesn't come with tempo on the queen. I go queen b6. And here, the best move is knight to a4. And after queen b7, keeping an eye on the knight. Pawn b4. Trying to put the knight on c5. That makes sense. My opponent castles, though. And here, I took on c3. The best move is taking here. And after knight e4, d4, rook c6, ef3, bishop f3. I saw this position, but I did not like this. I really didn't. Engine says, dude, just take the pawn. Yeah, okay. Easy for the engine to say. We're only up one pawn. But I took on c3 with the knight, which is also fine. Rook takes. If I take, then of course I lose the knight, so that's no good. So rook fc8 is fine. Pawn b4. White is slightly better. Bishop g4 is the best move. Rook c5 is the best move. And here, I decided to take on f3 and go e6, which is the only move to keep me in the game. And here, white is better. Yeah, so it's actually incorporating the idea I mentioned with rook c1, allowing this, going d takes, and playing an exchange down, but with the bishop pair and a passed pawn, which is very interesting. I wasn't sure it was enough for white, and I suppose my opponent came to the same conclusion as me. So we played rook c3, which after knight e7, the best move, leaves us with an equal position. Rook c1 is inaccurate, though. After take, rook c8, we need to take, knight f5. This is the best line for us. So I'm very happy to have found it. After queen c3, h5 is the best move. Yeah, lovely. The point of h5 is that let's say white creates some luft for his king. My idea was to go bishop g7. So that on queen c8, I could go king h7. And I was like, I don't know how white defends this. That was my idea. Queen e7 counterattacks. The engine suggests knight e3, fe3, king g8, and on check, bishop f8, go king g7 and bishop g6, sorry, d6, and thinks that we are better. Very similar to what happened in the game. My opponent goes g4, though, which is a mistake. It just creates too many weaknesses, and knight e3 is the crucial move. We have to play that. Knight d6 is also playable, avoiding the trade, but let's say we go bishop d6. Here, the position is dead equal. If not, white is better. We need to go for opposite-colored bishops. And although it typically can be drawish, here it's not because the queens are still on the board. As I said, if the queens come off the board, let's just say we trade the queens like this. And I save my bishop, of course. It's a dead draw. Dead draw. No one can do anything. Bishop g7 is a mistake. That's interesting. The engine actually wants the immediate queen d8, going for what I eventually realized was a very nice plan. Bishop g7 allows queen c8, king h7, and queen d7. And if here, then you have to find h4. That's the only move. We're still better, but my opponent goes queen c5. I go queen a6. Again, queen d8 is the best move. Even just sacrificing the a7 pawn and counterattacking with bishop h6. And if king f2, then queen h4, I assume, is winning. Our king always has this safe square. Yeah, queen a6, b5. queen a5, threatening infiltrations, queen b7, sorry, queen b4. And then I realize, okay, yeah, this is the way to get into the white position. And yeah, it's very hard for white to stop this. He does play the best move, queen e1, with the idea of meeting queen g5 with queen g3. And this is playable. I have to retreat and try something else in this position. I chose bishop f8. Engine prefers queen b6, hitting this pawn. And if I move like pawn a4... Oh, right. Okay, makes sense. And if queen b4, then bishop h6, and if king f2, queen c7, threatening. Yeah, there's just a lot. Bishop f8, a4. This isn't the best way of going about the position with bishop d6, but we're still better. Over time, we should be winning. h3 from white, which is a good move. We go bishop c7. Engine prefers bishop e7. To go bishop h4. I went bishop c7, king f1, queen d6. And although the engine says that these moves are subpar, firstly, we're very low on time. Secondly, one slip up and the game is over for white, which is effectively what happened. I feel like we're playing with very low risk because it's very hard for something to go wrong in our position because everything is so well protected. Whereas the white position, one slip up and everything crumbles. Here, queen c1 is the losing mistake. The only way to try and play on is queen d2. Stopping our infiltration. And then after king g7, you have to go pawn a5, which seems silly. And after queen a3, pawn a6, bishop a5, queen e2, queen c1, king f2. That's losing because of bishop d8. It's just so hard for white to defend everything. And his bishop is pointless. It's a useless piece. Queen c1 played, queen h2, and we're just threatening to win the queen. I thought he was going to go for a move like queen d1 so that he could meet this check with king e2. I thought that was his game plan. On queen d1, engine suggests f5, which was my other idea, to boot the bishop and take on h3, and then this g-pawn is going to be a monster. But he goes queen c6, and after bishop g3, there is no way to stop checkmate. Like, the king has no moves. If you give me a check, I just move the king, and, you know, taking on e6. If I take back, you still don't have enough checks. I guess my king just runs, and I'm up a bishop, but you can just not take the bishop, obviously, and just deliver mate on f2. So after bishop g3, my opponent resigns because it's game over. So yeah, don't accept a draw just because it's an opposite colored bishop position. Some of them obviously accept a draw, but like with queen still on the board, it was a 2-result game. Either we draw or black wins. There was no way white won that position, just because of how weak the white position was. So yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you want to see another very interesting game in the Panov Attack, check out the video up here. Like I said, the Panov is crucial to understand from both the white and the black side of the Caro. And if you want to see the previous episodes of this climb to 2200, check out the playlist down there. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in one of those videos.